Welcome to our rating agency spring update. I'm Jim Lenman, Kaufman Hall's Thought Leadership Group, and I have just a couple items to note before we begin the webinar. First, we encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A function on the webinar platform. We will get to as many of your questions as time permits during the hour. Second, we are recording this webinar and will share a link with you in an email within the next day or so. Moderating today's webinar are Robert Turner, a Managing Director and leader of our Treasury and Capital Markets practice, and Lisa Goldstein, also a Managing Director in our Treasury and Capital Markets practice. Joining Robert and Lisa today are Eva Bogarty, Associate Managing Director at Moody's Investor Service, Susie Desai, Senior Director at S&P Global Ratings, and Kevin Holleran, Senior Director at Fitch Ratings. We thank our panelists for taking the time to share their insights with us today, and I'll now turn the webinar over to Robert and Lisa.
Morning. I want to thank everybody for joining us. We're excited to provide another installment of the conversation we've been having now periodically for the last several years. We appreciate everybody taking time to join us today. I think we have a great panel again, and we've got some wonderful questions we're going to step through. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa. She's going to kick us off.
Great. Thanks, Robert. Hi, everybody. And thank you again, Susie, Eva, and Kevin, for spending your valuable time with us. First topic that comes to mind right now is cyber, and the biggest change in healthcare is Change Healthcare. So, Eva, why don't we start with you, and let's maybe start at the top of the funnel and talk first about cyber and what it is you're looking for when you meet with issuers of all sizes regarding cyber information.
Sure. Thank you. Kicking it off with the big one.
Yeah.
I think we got distracted by labor for a couple of years there, but obviously cyber is a big issue too, and it's going to be a persistent evil, so to speak, for the foreseeable future. So, good question. So I guess when we're talking to management teams, we want to hear what best practices you have in place and really how you've tested it. So things like how many risk mitigation strategies do you have in place? Do you have multi-factor authentication? Does your organization conduct phishing exercises? Are you running tabletop exercises? Are you using penetration testing and red team testing to identify system vulnerabilities? It's a long list. Do you have an incident response plan? Because obviously during cyber attacks, you're losing money and potentially lives. So, identifying who is in charge of what during the incident is really important. Other things we want to know about, personnel is there a dedicated cyber staff that reports to the C-suite? Are they making regular updates to the board? And I think lastly, is cyber a separate carve out in the IT budget, right? That helps us know that you are investing in this critical issue that is just escalating over time, because it's not if a system gets attacked, it's when, and obviously you have to keep ahead of the game here for cyber. And then I guess regarding vulnerabilities, I would just say that given the digitization of the industry, unfortunately, all parts of hospitals are pretty much vulnerable at this point. But we are, I think the real hot button vulnerability is third-party access to systems. It's time and time again a vulnerability. And even though your systems are secured and you're doing all of these great best practices, a third-party vendor may not be. So those are harder to monitor and tough.
So you would want information on a new term I learned, cyber hygiene, like going into the vendors as much as you can for those very reasons you mentioned.
Absolutely. I mean, all the questions we're asking you and the best practices we're expecting of hospitals should be expecting of their vendors.
Yeah. You mentioned capital. Susie, let me ask you, do you envision parsing out, say, annual capital spending now for cyber and IT versus, say, bricks and mortar and other strategies? Is that going to be, say, a new annual request on your data forms from issuers?
Yeah, and again, thanks for having us. And like Eva said, it wouldn't be healthcare without some event that we're now focused on, and certainly cyber is one of them. In terms of the capital and operating, I think we're still trying to get a sense of where the standards are and what the spending should be. I know there have been surveys put out that different groups have done, HHS has done, and as a percentage of IT spend, it's still pretty low. So I think categorizing it between capital and operating gets a little fuzzy. I think there's a lot more going through the operating side. So we are asking those questions. It's not coming through yet on our surveys, but we're certainly asking them in meetings about how much spend there is. But I think getting where the right amount may be different for different places. So I think we're still learning about that. I think we've heard some numbers, 8%-ish, but that seems, relative to other sectors, a little bit low. We've heard that looking at it as a percentage of revenues versus IT spend is another way to look at it. So I think we're, starting to ask some of these questions. Is it crowding out other spending? I mean, I think that is a question. It's a capital intensive sector, and with cash flow being a little bit lower than where it has been, I think there is a question about prioritization. So we are asking, all those questions that Eva had mentioned, and relative to the overall spending. So I think that's where, and we do ask, the other thing we ask also is about insurance costs.
Yeah.
Or insurance, what they have on that. Obviously, we don't publish that in our reports because that tends to be confidential and sort of gets to the bad actors. But that's another area that we ask about, and where that is and how expensive, and that has gotten obviously much more expensive. So that's, I think it's an evolving piece of the puzzle, but it's certainly one that we're getting more data on, and I think over time it'll, hopefully get a little bit cleaner.
You mentioned insurance, cyber insurance. Let me go to Kevin. Is that something that you're seeing more hospitals and health systems have, or is it part of their general insurance? Any views on that?
Yeah, sure. And again, great to be here. Thanks for having us, and looking forward to really from anywhere, and probably for some smaller providers, they're picking it up out of, one of the big nationals nationwide, Hartford, the Traveler, somebody like that. But I think in our space, the people who get ratings that we're dealing with, the most common vehicle usually is very specific, cyber insurance, specific carriers. And we don't have a preference. We don't make recommendations or anything like that, but we do want to, see that as you've got cyber insurance, it's more important than ever. Make sure you review it, at least annually. Yes, get those lawyers involved, and test it, kind of like we were saying a second ago, to make sure, is my coverage amount, do we think it's going to cover what might be, kind of a Category 5 storm, cyber event, so that you've got enough coverage. And we really see these cyber specific carriers because they get to more of the types of losses that need to be covered, so to speak. So there's business interruption, there is reputational damage, there's lawsuits you might take. And if it's sort of just baked into an umbrella, you might not get that specific thing that you're looking for. I think, though, Lisa, the more interesting conversation that's taking place or beginning to take place is, is the cost of the insurance now outweighing, the benefit? Is the premium cost more than what might really happen? And look, I can remember 20 plus years ago sitting down with a hospital, and it was the first time I'd heard this. They didn't have any medical malpractice insurance. And I thought, well, that's odd. I'd never heard of that before. But their whole issue was, look, it cost a fortune. Kind of to Susie's point, if I've got a $10 million package, then that's what I'm going to get sued for. And I think that's the question that we're about to cross. If we're not already there, do I go bare bones, or do we set up new captives for these things, or something along those lines? Because every time someone gets hacked and someone has an event, the next time we talk to them, they're like, yeah, the premiums are going up. And at some point, those lines are going to cross, right? It doesn't make it worth your while. So I think that'll be kind of interesting to see. Do we go bare bones? Do we have some other solution here?
Right. Okay. Interesting perspective. Didn't know about the MedMal case. I wonder if that particular hospital has it now, but.
They oddly enough, they did. I remember a bunch of us sitting in the room going, I don't know what to do with this. I've never seen it before. But, ultimately they came back to us and said, yeah, we've got it now. So we move forward. I remember.
Got it. Well, let's go right to Change Healthcare. So Eva, back to you. Have you done any back of the envelope estimate on what the impact on revenue, bottom line, or cash may be in the rated portfolio? And what are you hearing as you outlined kind of top of the funnel? What are the steps you're hearing specifically regarding this cyber attack right now?
Sure, yeah. Thanks. I think really wide range of exposure. I mean, we've done some outreach, obviously a concern for cash flow and liquidity, but most rated hospitals at least have decent liquidity. So, certainly a huge distraction and a big headache, if not more than a headache, but probably not a long-term impact here. And I think, scenarios range from like, do you have 100% change 100% for your clearinghouse affecting billing, hospital, physician, pharmacy, in that worst case scenario, which is really, really few systems. We are hearing that hospitals are facing up to a month of delayed revenue. So, obviously that's not great, but not the worst. And as far as, the funnel, the mitigation funnel, those with exposure, I think really hospitals were able to quickly go in and within 10 days switch clearinghouses, get that going. We have heard that that's caused some, increase in denials because you're going with like a plain vanilla package rather than your customized Change Healthcare package, but still better than nothing flowing. So that was first point. Hospitals seem to really be tapping their own liquidity or using lines of credit. So just as we'd expect a great management team to, assess liquidity needs and go in there and figure out how to get through this cash flow crunch. We do expect full recoupment of cash, so that's a positive here. And I think in terms of the advances, the Medicare and United advances, have heard that they're not covering everything. Some folks are utilizing them, but they also have a pretty quick repayment cycle, much, much quicker than we've seen in the past with emergencies. So like for Medicare, it's 90 days repayment after the state of emergency is cleared, and for United it's 30 days. So, not covering the full cost and pretty quick repayment, not everybody's first choice. And then I guess I would just say, I think even after it's supposed to clear up this week, fingers crossed, right? But we do expect that there will be some backlog for payers, some delayed processing, so it's not going to be over snap done.
Right.
There's going to be some reverberations from this that we'll be watching, but
so
overall.
It sounds like from your comments, you have not put the whole portfolio under review. Same question
No.
During COVID, early days of COVID. Are you going to put the whole portfolio under review? So
I think with these crises, we've all gotten pretty good at like honing in on who's most at risk and who do we need to reach out to. Low liquidity, low cash flow. These are the those are the immediate, outreach. How are you managing it, et cetera. And so far, the stories have been good. Folks are managing.
Okay. So on that note, Susie, some organizations have covenant measurement dates, March 31st every quarter. Probably about a third of the industry has a June 30 year end. Are you expecting S&P's perspective covenant violations? Are you expecting some downgrades to occur? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, we're not expecting a slew of downgrades from this, just given I think what Eva outlined with the workarounds that have been put in place, the access to the lines of credit, the financing from CMS and from United or Optum United. So we're not expecting that. I think we are, we're concerned about the weak liquidity credits because it could cause a little bit of a crunch. And that's probably where the focus is on in terms of covenants and where things might land. We haven't heard anything yet, but I know this is a month, right? Unfortunately, the timing wasn't great because it's hitting on a month and quarter. But so we're trying to evaluate that on the lower liquidity credits, and I think getting a sense of quarterly versus the semi-annual covenant calculations also comes into place. There could be some pressure to certain credits, but again, given where access has been, and we're starting to see some recovery in the switches that have happened, we're not expecting it. And I think those credits, that rely on a lot of their cash, like the self-liquidity programs, we're not really hearing. I mean, I think again, those are the ones that have access to CP and tapping lines, and as we would expect, they're using those in the short-term nature, and we'll see it sort of clean out over time here. I think there is operating noise. I think there will be denials. There will be some of that continuing through, and so it just adds to the sort of pressure that's on the sector. It may not be significant, but I think there will be incremental kind of earnings and denial pressure kind of going forward. The other thing that's just sort of interesting, as we talk about scale and larger systems, I think being able to switch and having relationships, having those access to lines, that's something that we have seen kind of in use, and so just something to note. And I think the other thing that we'll just be monitoring is kind of how organizations start to think about their relationships with these kinds of vendors that are very concentrated with one. I mean, we haven't heard we've heard folks starting to move to another place just to kind of move through this, but that also comes with its risk. So I think there'll be more to come on this.
Got it. Kevin, any thoughts on specifically the event happening right now? And also would like to, the broader topic of artificial intelligence, AI, what is it you want to hear in rating meetings, or is it more focused on, vendor relationships and everything we've been talking about?
Sure. I think we're probably in the same boat as everyone just alluded. We've been triaging our portfolio regarding change events. It's fairly axiomatic that the people that change work with are sort of the cream of the crop, and they got plenty of liquidity, and their tapping lines are doing all the things we just talked about. We did not also put the whole sector on alert. I will say I will not rule out the fact that we could potentially on some of those, what we would term high risk issuers with very light liquidity who are starting to get back to us with maybe some longer term lingering issues, that we could see a handful of rating watch negative, something along those lines. I won't rule that just out. We're still doing some due diligence, but this is, we've sort of coined it a big headache, a sector-wide headache. It is not, again, the asteroid that took out the dinosaur is not going to do the same thing to the sector either here. In terms of AI, it's funny. About 10 days ago, I was on a call with an organization. I won't say who, because we haven't published on them yet. And about 90 minutes into the meeting, I sort of stopped. I said, not a single person has said the word AI yet. I mean, no one's even brought it up, which was a new record at the time, I think. And, we all sort of chuckle a little bit about it. And there's a lot of people that are holding AI out there as the panacea that's going to cure all of our problems, right? This particular CEO is of the same opinion that I am, that look, AI can do incredible things, but at its core, healthcare is still really a very hands-on business. And I struggle. I think that this particular CEO that we're talking to also struggles a little bit with seeing, is AI going to be incremental or transformational? And I think we're sort of the idea that it will make some incremental changes here and there, but not necessarily transform care. When we had these kind of conversations and discussions 10 years ago, right, we were talking about the fear of being Uberized or Amazoned out of business and things like that. And I think all of us sort of sat at the table and said, look, until Amazon, I'm not picking on Amazon, but just to use them for an example, can send a drone to your house and cut you open and put something in or take something out, we're still going to have hospitals, right? And I think it's a lot of the same thing. AI is a wonderful thing, but you still need someone who's there by the bedside doing some work with you. So I think the old adage, plan for the worst, hope for the best, really holds true with AI, right? Look, invite AI into your organization, see what it can do for you. Be very realistic about what it's going to happen. Is this going to be incremental or revolutionary? And look, if it turns out to be revolutionary, and I think we all would hope that would be the case, but I don't think a lot of us are really counting on it. You've not wasted any time or energy or money. You're prepared for that. And if it does turn out to be just more incremental, which I think most of us are sort of thinking it is going to be, you won't regret that you didn't have, well, no regret strategies already in place because it wasn't, changing. So we talk about it a lot, but I think most people would say, look, we're just scratching the surface. We're a good 3, 5, 7 years out before we're going to see what it does for the sector. But I'll go out there and say, look, I think it'll be incremental change, certainly back office kind of things, but that bedside core, high acuity, I just don't see it changing too much what we're going to do.
Got it. Okay. Good discussion. Thanks. Robert?
So we're going to talk for a second about financial performance and covenants and rating activity. I think, Kevin, first for you, I know Fitch recently released its preliminary 23 medians. Maybe just have you talk a little bit about what you're seeing and your expectations for full year medians.
Yeah, no, good question. And I guess thanks for tuning in. If you saw our webinar, I appreciate that. We know people are going to be interested in the medians, and we have a hard time really signing off on them until we get all the 1231s, right? So that takes a little bit of time. So we took what we had and we ran some numbers, and the numbers actually show kind of some bad stuff. But that's really because it's borrowing so heavily from the front end of last year, where margins were lower. We didn't really sort of tip a scale until sort of the back half of the year, where you started seeing positive month-by-month numbers. So officially, when you look at the data, it says, yeah, margins are going to come down, but we're actually calling for an improvement to margins. So just to take you back, last year's median operating margin was 0.2%. So I always say pause there for a second. That means half of our book of business didn't make any money off of their operations. The other half, lost, obviously. What we believe that will turn into is about a 0.6, if you will. So not great, but if you want to look at the bright side, a tripling of where we were last year. So that's always a good thing to do. And we think that trend will continue going forward. So we think 2024 medians, which obviously we haven't seen anything on those yet, will probably be about a point higher, say 1.5%. We're sort of putting a stake in the ground for an operating margin. All that being said, the other sort of factor that we look at just to balance out operations and kind of cash, Robert, is, cash we think is just going to go sideways. It's standing right now about 220 days, which is roughly what it ended up last year. And it's not because people aren't trying and working harder, or that absolute levels of balance sheets aren't improving. They are. Our cash to debt numbers are actually increasing, and we think they'll certainly improve in 23 and in 24. But our expense bases are just getting so bloated right now, and basically you're just running parallel. So when we run the numbers, I'll be surprised if the 2023 cash on hand is much more than 5 days plus or minus 220, and maybe a little incremental change in 24, a little bit better, but not by much.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Susie, I guess curious first from you, and then even a second, what are you all seeing as you're, talking to clients?
Yeah, so, we put out, when we did our outlook, we also ran some preliminary medians for 2023. And so, yeah, similarly, it was the front end, mostly June, obviously fiscal year end. So those were coming in negative. So I think we had a median of 0.1%. And I think when we were running, again, mostly June, it was negative 0.2%. And I know the last quarter here, the last calendar quarter was a little bit better. There was a lot of 340B kind of running through there for many places. So, and just a general improvement that I think, we have seen losses come down. We have seen performance improve. I think that'll get pulled into that, last part, but we'll see how these calendar year ends kind of come out over. Oh, am I echoing, or is that's okay? Okay, sorry. But yeah, so I think we're seeing, generally, and I was just running, I know it's just the first part of the year, but, upgrades to downgrades, we've had 5 downgrades and 3 upgrades, but that is sort of easing from the prior year. And our outlook's interestingly 2 unfavorable and 6 favorable through February. So things are starting to stabilize a bit as you kind of look out. And similarly, I think we're seeing balance sheets kind of moving a little bit sideways, and just not seeing the growth that we had seen earlier back. And I think that's partly because cash flow is down, and while there are some investment earnings, it's just not as strong as it was, and with that expense growing, days cash on hand also moving sideways to down. And so I think things are improving, but those that have been doing well are continuing to do well. There is that group that had significant losses and they are starting to improve. So starting to see some underlying improvement, but we're still seeing some losses there. And then there's like a subgroup where things are getting better, but they're maybe they've kind of done some damage to the balance sheet. So just kind of in a tougher position that they're sort of navigating through. So I think, and of course we have some challenge credits still, but I think we've kind of seen the floor hopefully. And it's just really trying to get a sense of that recovery and where that visit, getting a line of sight on that for some of these places that are improving, but maybe not, back to where they were.
Great. Eva, anything you'd add?
Yeah, I would just, I guess I would underscore to that, still struggling. I think when we were here in June, we said it was 20%. We are down to it's 14 or 15%, still getting some numbers in for December quarterlies. That's the percentage that are not achieving a 1% operating cash flow margin. So there's still definitely some severe pain and struggling out there that we're seeing. So definitely all eyes on those credits. I think Kevin referenced them, in terms of the change impact. Those are the ones we're reaching out to for sure. Stabilization of operating cash flow margin, from September to December quarterlies we saw at 6%. And I think, Susie mentioned the one-time money coming in through December. So it will be really interesting to see, March. And of course, there's more disruption with change. So we'll see how the next 2 quarters go, really looking at that to see how the recovery goes. I know Susie mentioned upgrade to downgrade, so I'll just pile on that here while we're talking about that. We are at 7 downgrades to 5 upgrades. That's a 1.4 times ratio. So far this year, that compares to last year's first quarter, 14 downgrades, 2 upgrades. Wow. And then I ran the numbers, so that's a big difference, yeah. Right? I ran the numbers for the last 15 years of our downgrade to upgrade ratio, and the average was 2.1 times. So far this, I feel like that just indicates, some of the worst of that is behind us. I do think, to Susie's point, we are watching the folks that have lost cash. How are they, falling out in positioning, and what is their recovery looking like? So our eyes are on that as well.
Yeah, fascinating. Kevin, question for you. I guess I'm curious. We've seen an increase in various state, supplemental funds, et cetera. How do you view those? You see the risks associated with them, and maybe what would you ask clients to sort of talk about when they, discuss that with you?
And I think, Robert, a lot of people are leaning in on this question. So no pressure, Kevin and team, but how are you viewing these new state supplementals?
Well, I'll just go first and then let everyone else chime in. That way there's no pressure on me. Real quickly, I'll give you our upgrade downgrades as well too. I did run those right before the call started, and just to sort of pile on a little bit, I'm actually surprised at how little activity has taken place. Now it's not even a whole quarter, if you will, but we're equal right now. So 2 upgrades, 2 downgrades, if you will, which is, if you look at it in context to last year, we were 3-to-1 downgrades to upgrades, just to give a perspective. And unlike Susie, our sort of downward facing, if you will, outlooks are double our upward facing outlooks, so to speak. So a little bit of change in the outlooks, but our upgrade downgrades are basically, but if you even take it all together, not a lot of action going on. It's been fairly stable, if you will. So that's actually a good sign from my perspective, particularly when compared to last year. In terms of supplemental funding, we got a whole variety of them out there, from taxes that come in for certain organizations. I live here in Texas. We have districts, lots of tax issues that come there. Plans change all the time. We've got other supplemental fundings that come through. We've got Medicaid going direct payment, a variety of different things that are taking place, most of which tend to be positive, but it always raises that specter or that question of, well, what if it goes away? And that's the old adage, it's not a problem until it's a problem. So I think we really look for a couple of things. What is the historic track record? How long have those plans been in place? What's the a lot of times in the directed payments for Medicaid, some of the things, oh, how long is the current plan expected to last? And we're usually hearing like a, like a 5-year time frame, not annual, but a 5-year. And so you feel good for the first 2 or 3 years, and then you start to ask the question when it runs out, well, what's next? Is it going to continue? So I think, face value, we like to see that. Look, we all know this is a low margin business. We all know that there are certain players and providers that are out there that depend on supplemental funding in whatever form that it comes to you. And anytime we hear about or see about a threat, that really calls into, the quality of your earnings. Basically, can you make money without them? And if the answer is, we really can't, and we feel there's a threat to it, then we're very likely going to sit there and sit on a rating, maybe withhold an upgrade because we're worried about that going away, sort of a thing. And in some cases, maybe you're at the end of the spectrum, and we've got to consider maybe a downgrade because your revenue stream gets cut off. So everybody's got a unique story, I guess is the best way to put it. But they're prevalent in the sector, and so we tend to ask a whole lot of questions, but very specific to that entity and that individual credit that we're looking at the time. So kind of a broad way of saying that we view them as a good thing, but it's always take it with a grain of salt and a little bit of worry that it could go away, and that gets into kind of a question I get asked frequently, and I'm going to just weave it in, then I'm going to stop talking. But a lot of people talk about how do we fix the system writ large, right? And the question I get asked is the government going to help? And I'm always like, let me disabuse you of that notion right now. I don't see anything coming out of the government, federal, state, local, really to really bail us out. We have a huge deficit, we have a huge debt, and you really got to take care of your own self, so to speak, and pull yourself up by your bootstraps and make that margin. And so at the end of the day, again, we're probably growing a little bit more cautious about these supplemental plans, that they could ultimately go away. And like I say, we're probably sitting on some ratings that might be upgraded otherwise.
I guess maybe Susie would have you comment, and then Eva after Susie on the same.
Yeah, it's certainly helping sort of the cash flow declines that we've seen. It kind of shows some of the erosion that's happened underneath. But it's certainly, been benefiting a lot of organizations, just over the last couple of years, especially this directed payment program where you're getting average commercial rates sometimes on your Medicaid population, which is, kind of unheard of. But with that benefit comes, the risk. And within our criteria, we do have some language around that. And so we continue to monitor those. We haven't seen them go through kind of state fiscal distress and what might happen there. But it's usually a variety of programs, but that directed payment one really seems to be a game changer for a lot of places, and certainly maybe helping some of the rural hospitals, some of the hospitals that were really at risk. So we ask a lot of questions about it. We want to know how long it's going. It kind of creates some noise sometimes on cash flow and liquidity still. So just want to understand how the organization is thinking about it as well. I know we talk to places where they're like, yeah, this is coming. We're looking at it as an investment. But we want underlying improvement, and so we want to understand how the organization is thinking about it. But it's certainly been a benefit to a lot of organizations that we've seen.
Great, Eva. Anything you'd want to add? We're working on a mute issue here. Give us 2 seconds. All right. Well, I tell you what.
I'm unmuted. I'm muted.
Okay.
I'm sorry if there's an echo coming from me, but I guess just a couple of points I'd like to add is that, as we see these rise and, certainly in some cases obscure core operations, we really, you always are great and ask, what do we want to see in presentations? This is an area we want to see more in presentations, right? We want to see, the breakout year over year of the changes in the buckets of payments, more information on Medicaid versus Medicaid supplemental payments. What are the numbers, how they've been trending? Also what, to Kevin's point, when are approvals up? And then I think finally, show us both the payments that you're getting as well as the tax that you have to pay, so we can work through that net amount. So that's my only add to this conversation.
No, that's great. Well, we've got you. Maybe talk a little bit about this sort of growing penetration, Medicare Advantage plans, sort of what, how you all are thinking about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is the big topic other than Change Healthcare, right? I think there are a couple things happening, right? We have aging baby boomers through 2030, and so these Medicare Advantage plans are just going to keep growing. There's going to be more exposure. I think we're projecting by 2030, 60% of Medicare enrollees will be covered by Medicare Advantage plans. That's, a big number. We're seeing that basically MA plans, that made a lot of money during early days of the pandemic now are trying to figure out how to keep making money, right? And most of the ways they can keep money hurt hospitals, right? So they can deny more, delay authorizations, increase their risk coding. Yes, they can increase their star rankings, but most of these impact hospitals, hospital revenue to the negative. So this is going to be a big issue, pinching profitability for the next several years. And I think one other point, as we're looking at this, as we see greater exposure to Medicare Advantage for hospitals, we see 3 dominant insurers. You've got your United Health, your Humana, your Elevance, formerly Anthem. So they now cover 65% of Medicaid Advantage programs, patients, as well as dominating commercial. So this really gives a lot of leverage, a lot of negotiating leverage to the insurer. So, we're thinking that contract negotiations are going to be tough in the next several years, and especially in markets that are dominated by 1 or 2 insurers, right? So, I mean, and I guess, not to be a Debbie Downer, but a small sliver of bright side, I think, obviously CMS, the government's aware of this. So, little modest new rules in January 2024 around pre-authorization, right, and against downgrading admissions will help modestly improve revenues. But I do think this is a real profitability issue for hospitals.
I want to keep going because we've got a lot of questions, and it's tempting to ask each of you about each of these, but I want to try to make sure we cover all the ground we can. Maybe I just get maybe Kevin and then Susie, we just have you talk a little bit about what you're hearing with respect to covenants. I think our perspective is we can see some challenges, and we see some repeat challenges now where some of our clients are seeing sort of now a consecutive year of challenges or in sequence. I guess I'd be curious to hear what you're seeing and how you're thinking about that.
Susie, go ahead. He wants both of us. You go ahead.
Oh, okay. So yeah, no, there are some credits that are still challenged, and we're seeing that, like you said, the second year. It does seem, on another subset though, I think they're maybe out of the woods for the moment. So again, when we have covenant violations, kind of going into that second year, we're asking, what are those negotiations? Where are you at? Is it the banks? Is it, is it the MT? Is it the public debt? It's not an automatic, downgrade necessarily, just because you violate a covenant. Of course, it depends on what's going to happen. I think it's those, again, with the weaker liquidity, where it can cause issues is where those have weaker liquidity. And if the downgrade is going to start, causing a lot of issues in terms of now you got to deal with your bank debt, you got to refinance or pay it off, or your lines, it starts to really crunch things. I think if there's a plan and your kind of the waivers are in motion, we want to understand sort of what's underlying it, because there could be underlying factors of your operating trend causing some of the covenants that could lead to a downgrade by itself, but the covenant itself doesn't necessarily lead to it. But certainly we're watching a few that do have that second year kind of coming through.
And Robert, we're seeing a lot of the same. So, I think we all have said, 22 is probably operationally the worst year we hopefully will ever see in our lifetime. But for some people, 23 was almost as bad, or they had a good 22 and they waited till 23 to have a really bad year. So some of this is a little bit variable. I think in general, most people we're talking to, it's a little bit more favorable. Part of that has to do with the market rebound in 23, which has really helped coverage levels. And so a lot of folks are telling us, look, we'll make it far better than we did last year. Even though our raw operations weren't quite as good, we're actually looking better from a coverage standpoint. And for those who are really on the bubble, it's, well, I need you to sort of run it out to me year end. What's it look like? And again, very, very few people are reporting back to us. I mean, we can, one hand kind of count that, A, we think we're going to have a serious problem, and B, we're having difficult discussions with some of our bondholders. I think the overwhelming answer is we're either A, going to be okay, or B, we're close enough that bondholders got it, and they're going to kind of go along with us here. So this is not the thing that's keeping me up at night anymore. I guess there's a variety of other things to do, but right now I think the debt service coverage thing that did keep us up at night in 22 is starting to attenuate, to ease off.
Yeah, great. Susie, anything you'd add?
No, I think
you went
Susie or Eva, sorry.
No, I agree. I do think, it might be more than one hand that have issues. It's my only prediction there. But, the folks who are having trouble are pretty much known. It's a known quantity now, and, overall a better picture for covenants.
Yeah, great. Okay. We had this question toward the end of the list, but I think sort of based on the feedback from our panelists, we moved it up. And I know this is a broad question, but what is keeping you up at night? It's been probably 5 or 6 months since we got together in October. What's taking most of the airtime in committee? It'd just be interesting to just get your insights as you're thinking about that. Maybe Eva, why don't you go first, and then Susie, and then Kevin.
Sure. A couple of things, but I think I would just broadly categorize it of is there a return to normal? And what does it look like? And, how many of these are, the problems seem to be very sticky, right? So it is really, like, first of all, the unknown, like the Change Healthcare out there, that keeps us up at night, because when you're in a continued suppressed operating profitability environment, the unknown is really the thing, as we've seen year over year, right? So I think it's that, and it's sort of, when for the ones who are just not rebounding in volumes and market, and how are folks landing with this shifting, I think is kind of, what I mull over, what does the next couple of years look like, and what does it mean for the industry?
Gotcha. Susie?
I think, I think similarly, the operating kind of environment and where credits are seeing kind of, where they're headed, it certainly takes up a lot of time in committees and what we kind of think about. And are we going to get back to that 2 or 3% or whatever that right number is, or is it going to be lower? And then what does that mean strategically for the organization? So, still, trying to assess that. I think the cyber, those events, I mean, I would say it's like kind of like a hurricane. It can happen at any time, but it can happen anywhere in the country, and not just on your coastlines. So that is taking up, a lot of the discussion, especially as of late. And I think the other thing, I think we are hearing a lot more on AI, and I would agree that, it is going to be incremental, but we do hear that, it's going to help with the burnout. It's going to help with a lot of, making, efficiencies. And that's really, everyone's saying, how are we going to operate with, less labor? Well, these are the things, right? Length of stay, getting people through, maybe some of these AI things that will help, kind of drive some of these efficiencies through, and hopefully kind of start changing sort of that overall structure of the organization. So I think those are the few key things but yeah, a lot of time on operations still in our discussions.
Kevin?
Yeah, I'll keep it short. I agree with everything there. Aside, obviously, from change and AI, I would say the two big positives that I think we talk about a lot is, generally speaking, volumes. Not for everybody, but for 2/3 of our book of business, I think volumes are back, and some people are starting to get capacity constrained and all of that. That's ultimately a good thing, even though it's a short-term pay point. I think there's a settling down of the labor environment in general. We certainly ask questions about that, and that's also, I would call it a win sort of for the sector. But I think the thing that keeps, certainly keeps me up at night, and I think it keeps, a lot of people we deal with maybe up at night, and it's hard for me to even bring up because I'm naturally an optimistic person, but the reality is a lot of people are starting to talk about, and you hear the phrase, this proverbial, are we at a tipping point, in the sector or the industry? And then secondly, what do we do about it? And we've all on this phone call at some point talked about kind of a structural imbalance between the way we're reimbursed and what things cost and how the lines cross, and it's very hard to uncross them, so to speak. And there's not a lot of help coming. So I think a lot of people feel that there's a window right now. We've got maybe a 5-year window where we've got to figure out a way to come out the other side. Let's call the other side that 2030 year, which a lot of us have started to reference as a big date we need to circle on our calendars and watch out, whether it's MA plans and that shifting the power, if you will, over to the payers again. People are leaving the workforce. Aged population gets sicker and sicker, that sort of a thing. So we've got to figure out some way to get through the next 5 years and pick up some momentum. Yeah, I used to coach my kids' soccer team. Every time they'd run in to kick the ball, it was to get a running start, so you get some momentum behind them. It's the same thing here. We've got a little bit of a window here to build some momentum, to figure out how to get past and get through this tipping point, to see what the sector is going to look like right around that 2030 timeframe. So that's kind of what keeps me up at night.
So let's talk a little bit about sort of the balance sheet impacts of this, because I think, we've been talking about operations, performance, et cetera. I guess, Susie, you touched on this. We don't get to margins we had, before COVID. What's that going to do for capital spending? I mean, how do you see clients balancing that? What's your perspective?
Yes, I think we saw last year, obviously pullback, a little bit of pullback on capital spending, although we did see spending happening in those areas where there was growth, so the Floridas, the Texas, the regions that were experiencing a lot of growth. Those kind of continued because some of those numbers were up. Now we are starting to hear more from like sort of the next level of candidates there on spending. So it is starting to perk up there. But there are some that are still managing to cash flow and are struggling. So it's sort of those that have the better cash flow, starting to move forward, or are feeling like they have to kind of move forward because they've been delayed long enough. And then there are others that are struggling and still kind of reprioritizing, trying to figure out what the right thing is. And then there's ones that are just still holding to cash flow and saying we're not moving forward until we can kind of get better visibility. And it's just also like resources and time, right? A lot of focus on the operating side. So we're starting to hear some, that next level. And usually generally the higher rated credits starting to move on some of the bigger spending, but we still have a lot that are still kind of waiting and finding the right moment and reevaluating projects.
So maybe along the same lines, are you seeing an uptick in the issuance of debt on a corresponding basis?
It's starting to move too on that front. Again, it's those same providers there. So we are starting to hear rumblings of new money coming through. We've been a little bit more active through this first quarter with some additional for the rest of this year, and then we're hearing from our FA friends and bankers, maybe just a little bit more going into 25 as well. So and certainly variable rate is perked up as well, but still a lot of fixed rate debt too.
Kevin, I'm curious, how do you view somebody who sort of curtailed capital spending to build liquidity? Like what goes through your mind as you see situations like that? Because I think that's the other choice, right?
Yeah, as long as it's a short-term strategy, we really don't see any long-term effects, right? So particularly if you're in a brand new plant or something along those lines. But it's perfectly fine with us, as far as I'm concerned, to sort of dial down the capital spending under periods of cash flow operational stress, as long as there's an expectation we're going to dial it back up again, particularly as Susie said, in those competitive markets, those growth markets. You only really start to get I think analytically really worried when they dial it down and they just stay down there. And that's building cash maybe the wrong way, so to speak, because you're creating a bigger hole ultimately to fill. And the price of goods is not really going down that much. And so when you do finally have to address it, instead of it being a $100 billion problem, it's a $200 billion problem for you. So we've always said, look, we kind of reserve the right to say, you've dug yourself a really big hole from a capital perspective. We might downgrade you even though your cash has never looked stronger, because we know you've got to spend in the future, that sort of a thing. So temporary, totally fine, totally understandable. Matter of fact, that's what good management teams do. But if you stay down there, that's when our antenna starts to buzz a little bit. We get nervous about the credit.
I know it's a difficult period of time to make, to do this, but do you still want to see projections? I assume so, but I maybe just talk about that. That's lots of nodding.
Absolutely, we want to see projections. Yeah, I've been saying for many years, and we've been so hyper focused on the pandemic and then labor-demic and now change-demic, or whatever we're going to call it, that we sort of lost track of what do you want to be when you grow up? What's that strategic goal? And in particular, as I was alluding to earlier, what's our path through to this? Again, through this tipping point. What do I want to be when I come out of this? And I think we really want to focus on that strategy more than ever before, and that involves projections. So absolutely we do.
Great. All right, I want to keep going. Lisa, maybe I'll turn it back over to you. We can talk a little bit about consolidation.
Yeah, consolidation continues. We would really like to get your thoughts on what you're seeing in regards to buzz and hearing regarding consolidation plans in the face of greater scrutiny by the FTC or state regulators. Susie, let me start with you.
Yeah, I think there's still, a lot of, for those that are looking for partners, wanting to find partners, they're still going at it. It's certainly been interesting. We've seen some definitive agreements kind of fall away, which is sort of unusual when it's not a regulatory reason. So that's been kind of interesting to watch. And some of these, I think the other thing, so we are hearing, some providers, it's not like everyone's running out there to jump on that, but there are certainly some providers that have wanted to partner. They're going to continue to look for a partner, or look for ways to kind of get scale, maybe in different ways going forward, but certainly still focused on that. There are some providers that are, and we've seen some things close, not close, literally close, but transactions close. So I think those that want to are still looking at it. There is more scrutiny, and I think we're starting to hear more about these states that are providing even more scrutiny there. I know California's passed a rule that, starting in April, they're going to be looking at things. I know, we talked about Indiana doing that. So it's just going to make it a little bit tougher. But it does feel like these organizations have a pretty good read on, where they're going to find trouble and where they're not. And so I know that goes into, at least from a regulatory perspective, that certainly goes into some of the discussion points. So we are seeing it, especially for the challenge providers, trying to find some back office efficiencies, trying to find some scale. But it's not, obviously it's not, and we'll see, the other piece, I think, we've seen some big scale mergers, and I think, the jury's out a little bit on, is that working? Is it? And so we continue to ask those questions, like, what are you doing together that you couldn't do before, and trying to get the benefits of that. So there's certainly a lot of that kind of discussion happening too. So, it's certainly a mixed bag, but certainly a focus for many providers, particularly those that are struggling.
Right. And we had a writing question actually yesterday. You mentioned Indiana putting forth new regulation about a greater advance notice on transactions of certain sizes in the healthcare space. Eva, let me kick it over to you. When, with the announcements that come out, when do you take rating action or put out a comment or some combination of the both?
Sure. We've gotten like crystal clear on this. We don't comment until definitive agreement. I mean, you might see it in a credit opinion or a write-up, but we're not going to put out a comment saying, these two are planning to come together, and here are the potential impacts, until a definitive agreement. That's when we'll go out there with something. And then we won't take rating action until closing. That is our hard line, because things go in all different directions.
Right.
So that's the way we handle that.
Right. And are there certain aspects that you have seen, rating committee has seen, that makes for what will be a successful merger? however defined?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very clearly articulated plan of full integration and along every single line, right? It's really, you know, you do this, I do this, this is what's happening, this is what's our name's going to, everything. This is when we're changing the name in these places, you know, really full scale articulated plan.
Got it. Got it. Okay. And Kevin, Susie, what about your shops? When do you take rating action when a merger is announced? Kevin, with you?
Very similar in regards. So LOIs get announced all the time. We kind of ignore them. I've always said anecdotally, half of them, you know, fail to consummate anyway, so we just don't get excited about them. We won't do anything from a rating standpoint until at least closure. And even then, depends on what the closure looks like. If they merged obligated groups, so they kept them outstanding, that sort of a thing. So we really do, as you know, the old joke is we follow the money. And what does the bondholder have remedy to? The new parent, the new co, or just the bonds I bought previously? So we do occasionally have, you know, mergers that come together, might be rated differently, and they stay different because the bondholders here don't have access here and vice versa, that sort of a thing. So we really are a much more measured approach on that. And I think maybe to your other point about, you know, mergers and things like that, it is. It's you know, even Ken Coffin said, looks like everyone can merge except healthcare. You know, right? So it's everybody's talking to everybody, and we've got to get very creative. So the one thing I guess I would say that we've seen maybe a little bit more of than we have is more outsourcing, if you will. That used to be kind of a third rail. People didn't like to do it, but it gets back to that core competency. And if, look, I'm not the best person who can do X, Y, or Z, maybe I can find someone who is. And that's not a merger, but it's certainly a way for me to maybe grow and focus on my core competencies and not worry about some of this back office stuff. So that's something I think we're seeing a little bit more of. Just a comment quickly on that.
And just really quickly, we also may take an outlook at the definitive stage. We don't do anything until that definitive, and it's usually an outlook potentially where we think maybe the rating's headed. And then we, you know, when the organizations come together, we have our criteria, group rating methodology criteria, where we would determine kind of what the rating is. And, you know, and I won't go into detail there, but we you know, we may make some adjustments at that point to that close. And then, you know, in terms of just kind of mergers and how we look at those, you know, we're, again, trying to understand the strategy. I think to Eva's point, you know, just that understanding that integration, because we've seen ones that have fallen apart where there hasn't been full integration. And so that is an important aspect in how they're thinking about that. And while and the other piece is obviously culture. And then while it may not always be 1 + 1 = 3, again, we want to know what is it that you're doing together that you couldn't do separately, whether it's efficiencies in scale or whatever it might be, but just want to understand that and what the purpose of the merger was for.
Got it. Okay.
I guess may I add one clarification?
Yes, of course.
I forgot that we will sometimes, I was thinking through Kevin's comments here of, you know, whether the ratings will change, et cetera, at closing, that we will sometimes, if we believe the rating is going to change, put a rating under review for either upgrade or downgrade prior to closing at a point where we are like near 100% sure that closing is occurring. So I think that's important. I never want people to be surprised when we come and say, we're putting your rating under review. So I just wanted to get out there that is one added nuance we do.
And that is a rating committee decision, right? Everything goes through the committee. Robert, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we always run out of time. We didn't even talk about labor, or not to any real significant degree, which if you think about it is a little strange. I guess, Kevin, just real quick, anything you're seeing in terms of trends on contract labor, it just feels odd that we didn't talk about that.
No, not talking about labor is a good sign, really.
That's right.
Throw that out there. Yeah, look, when we talk to people, almost universally, we ask, you know, 3 questions, like, you know, how much contract or external contract labor is in the house? Again, virtually everybody's saying it's down, it's way down, kind of a thing. And the per hour rate, it's come down. I've finally started hearing the last couple of months, look, it's down to pre-pandemic levels or pre-labor-demic levels, whichever you like. It's at what it used to be 5 years ago, then that's also a very good sign. And then the last thing that we hear all the time is, we ask how much your hiring is doing. Yeah, we're hiring more people than are leaving, so we're keeping people. So, kind of the phraseology I've heard is retention is the new recruitment. So I'm keeping people, right? They're not leaving, and that is a big plus for us. So we're not talking about labor as much, but when we do, it's generally a pretty good news story. There's some exceptions, but generally a pretty good story.
Great. Well, listen, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank our panelists, each of you, for being part of this with us today and taking time and providing your insights. I want to thank the audience for joining us. We're pleased to get to do this again, and we'll plan to do so probably sort of July, August timeframe. So more to come with that. But again, I just want to thank everybody for joining us, and hope you have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Robert.
you.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.
Be good.